Imagine it's 2030, and something feels different. Not dramatically different. Not the kind of different you see in movies about the future, with chaos and noise and visible collapse. Just quietly different. You walk through a city and something is slightly off, but you can't immediately name it. Then slowly it becomes clear. Fewer couples, fewer young families, fewer men in the spaces where men used to show up with intention, with pursuit, with visible investment in building something with someone else. And the strangest part of all? No outrage about it, no protests, no emergency broadcasts, no collective alarm, just a low, ambient shift in the texture of everyday life. A stillness where there used to be motion. And if you tried to trace it back, tried to find the moment it started, the moment someone could have pointed at it and said, "This is where the direction changed," you wouldn't find a single moment. Because it didn't happen all at once. It happened one decision at a time. One man stepping back, then another, then thousands, then millions. Each decision quiet, each one personal, each one feeling from the inside, like nothing more than a man choosing what made sense for his own life, but added together, accumulated across years, across cultures, across economic classes and age groups and geographies. Those individual decisions became a pattern, and that pattern became a direction. And that direction, if nothing changes, leads somewhere specific. Somewhere most people are not prepared for. Because here's the first thing you need to understand about what's actually happening. Most people who look at this trend make the same mistake. They assume it's temporary. They frame it as a phase, a reaction, a pendulum that swung too far in one direction and will inevitably correct itself. They say, men will come back. The incentives will rebalance. Human nature will assert itself, and things will return to something closer to what they were. And that assumption is wrong, not because the future is fixed or inevitable, but because this shift is not emotional. It is structural. There is a fundamental difference between behavior that comes from frustration, from temporary dissatisfaction, from a wound that heals and returns the person to their previous patterns, and behavior that comes from a structural recalculation, a genuine reassessment of costs and returns that produces a new operating logic. Frustration is temporary. It fluctuates with mood and circumstance and the passage of time. Structural adaptation is stable. It compounds, it spreads, it becomes, over time, the new baseline that subsequent behavior is measured against. And what is happening with men and relationships right now is structural. Men are not reacting to a bad experience and temporarily withdrawing until they feel ready to try again. Men are adapting to an environment that has changed in ways that are real, measurable, and unlikely to reverse quickly. And once a behavioral shift becomes adaptive rather than reactive, it doesn't move backwards easily. It stabilizes, it normalizes, and then, critically, it spreads. Because here is the principle that governs all of this at the deepest level. Men follow incentives, not social expectations, not cultural narratives about what they should want or what they're supposed to pursue, not pressure, however well-intentioned or forcefully applied. Incentives. This is not a cynical observation. It is a biological and historical reality. Look at any period in human history where men invested heavily in commitment, in family formation, in the construction of long-term partnerships. In every case, the environment provided clear and reliable incentives for that investment. Social recognition, financial benefit, legal protection, clear role and status within a structure that valued and rewarded his contribution. The incentives were visible, the returns were predictable, the exchange felt proportional, and men committed, massively, consistently, across generations. Now look at what's changed. The incentives have shifted, not disappeared entirely, but shifted enough that the calculation many men are running, consciously or not, is producing a different result. The social recognition for commitment has diminished. The financial risks attached to long-term partnership have increased and become more visible. The legal structures surrounding marriage have, in the perception of many men, become disproportionately risky. The role of the committed man has become simultaneously more demanding and less clearly valued. And the result, entirely predictable if you understand the underlying principle, is withdrawal. Not out of spite, out of optimization. Men are optimizing for outcomes rather than approval. And right now, for a significant and growing portion of men, the outcomes point away from traditional relationship structures. So look at what's already visible even before we get to 2030. Less pursuit, less initiation, less willingness to carry the full weight of romantic pursuit without reciprocal investment, less long-term planning structured around partnership, more focus on personal stability, individual financial independence, self-directed life architecture. This is not a fringe phenomenon. The data is there. The demographic trends are measurable. The behavioral shifts are documented across multiple countries and cultures simultaneously. And 2030 is not a dramatic departure from this. 2030 is simply the continuation of a line that has already been drawn. The question is not whether the line exists. The question is where it leads. And the first place it leads is a fundamental imbalance in relationship dynamics. Think about what happens to any market when participation on one side decreases significantly. The basic mechanics shift. If fewer men are actively participating in the dating and relationship landscape, if fewer are pursuing, initiating, investing in the early and costly stages of relationship formation, then the supply of that investment decreases, and the demand, which has not decreased at the same rate, remains relatively constant. That imbalance produces effects that are already beginning to be felt, and will become considerably more pronounced by the end of this decade. Suddenly, the investment that men used to provide freely, the pursuit, the initiation, the visible commitment of time and resources toward building something, becomes scarcer. And scarcity changes perception. It changes how things are valued. It changes the dynamics of every interaction in that space. And not in ways that are simple or easily managed. Because here's the paradox that sits at the center of this shift and makes it particularly complex. As male participation decreases, standards and expectations don't decrease with it. They increase. This sounds counterintuitive until you think about how it actually works in practice. When something becomes less available, the response is rarely to want it less. The response, particularly in the short term, is to want it more, to expect more from the interactions that do occur, to hold out for something that justifies the scarcity. So you get a situation where the men who remain engaged in relationship formation become increasingly selective, where the bar for what justifies long-term investment rises, where commitment, genuine deep commitment, becomes something extended less frequently and more carefully. And simultaneously, the expectations of what that commitment should look like when it does occur continue to escalate. Rising standards on both sides, declining overall commitment, less total investment moving through the system, more friction in every individual interaction. This is the paradox that makes the 2030 landscape particularly interesting and particularly challenging. Because desire doesn't disappear. Connection doesn't stop being something people want. But the structures through which connection used to flow reliably are becoming unstable. And that instability produces consequences that extend far beyond the personal lives of the individuals involved. Because when you follow this trend further, when you look at what happens not just to individual relationships, but to the broader social structures that individual relationships build, you arrive somewhere much larger than a dating market imbalance. You arrive at family formation, marriage rates, birth rates, the demographic structure of the society itself. And here, the consequences become genuinely significant in ways that operate on a timescale of decades, not years. Fewer long-term partnerships means fewer stable family units. Fewer stable family units means declining birth rates in populations already hovering near or below replacement level. Declining birth rates produce demographic imbalances that create economic pressure that generates social instability that feeds back into the original dynamic in ways that accelerate rather than correct the underlying trend. This is not speculation. This is the observable trajectory of multiple developed societies that are already several years further along this curve. Japan, South Korea, several Northern European countries. The pattern is consistent. The timeline differs, but the direction is the same. And the response in those countries, the policy interventions, the social campaigns, the financial incentives designed to encourage family formation, have produced, at best, marginal effects, because you cannot solve a structural incentive problem with surface-level interventions. You cannot change behavior by telling people their behavior is wrong when the behavior is a rational response to the environment they actually live in. And this brings us to the midpoint of this picture, the point where this stops being a conversation about dating and becomes a conversation about something much larger. Because when enough individuals change their behavior in the same direction at the same time, the system changes with them, not as a consequence, as a transformation. The system does not stay the same and simply accommodate the new behavior. The system itself shifts, new norms emerge, new expectations form, new structures develop to fill the spaces left by the old ones. And that process, once it reaches a certain threshold of adoption, is self-reinforcing. Because here is the first rule that governs this kind of systemic change. When effort stops, systems adjust. This is not a moral statement. It is a mechanical one. When one side of a dynamic reduces its investment, the entire system must recalibrate. The old equilibrium cannot hold because the inputs that maintained it are no longer present at the same level. So expectations shift. Behaviors on both sides adjust to the new reality. New norms form around the new baseline. And what was once considered unusual, men choosing independence over pursuit, men declining long-term commitment as a default assumption, men structuring their lives around individual optimization rather than partnership, becomes gradually normalized, and then expected, and then simply the way things are, which leads directly to the second rule. Scarcity redefines value. We touched on this earlier, but it deserves its full examination here. When something that was previously abundant becomes scarce, its value shifts, not necessarily in the direction you'd expect, because scarcity doesn't always produce increased respect or appreciation for the thing that has become rare. Sometimes it produces resentment. Sometimes it produces competition. Sometimes it produces a fundamental restructuring of what people consider worth pursuing at all. And in the context of committed partnership becoming genuinely scarcer in the social landscape, what you get is a combination of all three. Some people respond to the scarcity by valuing commitment more deeply when they do encounter it. Some respond by competing more aggressively for it. And some, perhaps the most significant group for the long-term trajectory, respond by reconsidering whether it was what they actually needed in the first place, by redesigning their sense of what a complete and satisfying life looks like without it as a central element. And that redesign, once completed, is very difficult to undo, because you cannot recreate a need that someone has genuinely moved past. And the third rule completes this picture. When systems feel unstable, individuals default to independence. This is observable across every domain of human behavior. When the structures that people relied on for security and stability become unpredictable or unreliable, the natural response is to internalize the source of stability, to stop depending on external structures and start building internal ones, to prioritize control over reliance, self-sufficiency over dependency. And once that mindset becomes the operating framework for how a person navigates the world, it becomes the new baseline. Everything is evaluated through the lens of, does this increase or decrease my autonomy? Does this strengthen or weaken my independence? Does this add to my stability or introduce risk into it? And most traditional relationship structures, evaluated through that lens, come up short. Because genuine partnership requires a degree of interdependence, it requires the willingness to make yourself somewhat vulnerable to another person's decisions, to accept that their choices will affect your life in ways you cannot fully control. And for a man who has built his entire psychological architecture around independence and control of outcomes, that vulnerability can feel not like intimacy, but like risk, not like connection, but like exposure. And so the default becomes independence, not as a temporary measure until something better comes along, as the permanent preferred operating mode. Now picture two paths emerging side by side in this landscape. One group of men continues engaging with traditional relationship structures, pursuing, committing, building families, accepting the full weight of what that investment requires. The other group moves in a different direction, not dramatically, not in obvious protest, simply in the quiet, daily direction of individual building, personal financial independence, physical development, skill acquisition, life architecture designed entirely around their own priorities. And here is what happens over time. The gap between those two paths does not stay constant. It grows, not just in lifestyle, in mindset, in what feels normal, natural, and desirable, in what feels worth the cost and what doesn't. And eventually, somewhere along that diverging trajectory, the two paths stop being different choices within the same value system. They become different value systems entirely, with different definitions of success, different frameworks for meaning, different answers to the question of what a life well lived actually looks like. And when that happens, the possibility of bridging the gap doesn't just become difficult. It becomes, for many people, something they stop trying to do. And here's the uncomfortable element of this picture that most analyses of the trend avoid directly. Power follows investment. This principle operates with the consistency of physics in human dynamics. The one who invests less holds more leverage. The one who is less attached to the outcome negotiates from a stronger position. The one who is genuinely willing to walk away controls more of the terms. When men collectively reduce their investment in relationship formation, when the pursuit, the initiation, the visible demonstration of commitment that used to flow reliably from men toward partners becomes genuinely scarce, the power dynamic shifts, not as an intended strategy, not as a coordinated effort, simply as the mechanical consequence of changed investment patterns. And that shift in power dynamics, distributed across millions of individual interactions, produces a changed social landscape, where the rules of engagement are different, where the assumptions that used to govern how men and women approached each other carry less weight, where new dynamics emerge that neither side fully anticipated and neither side fully controls. And this is why the trend accelerates rather than corrects, because the dynamic shift itself becomes part of the incentive structure. Men who step back gain leverage. That leverage produces better outcomes in certain domains of their lives. Those outcomes reinforce the decision to stay back, and other men observe those outcomes. Information spreads, experiences get shared, patterns become visible. And once enough people see the same pattern producing the same results, it becomes normalized behavior rather than deviant behavior. The social cost of choosing independence drops, the social permission to make that choice expands, and the rate of adoption accelerates. And here is what most people will miss about this process as it unfolds. Because the biggest social shifts are almost never the ones that announce themselves loudly. They are the ones that happen in the background of daily life, gradual, distributed, composed of individual decisions that each seem unremarkable in isolation. No one wakes up one morning and declares that the social contract around relationships has fundamentally changed. Instead, people wake up one morning and simply notice that things are different, that the expectations they held, the assumptions they made about how things work, are no longer producing the results they anticipated, that something shifted while they weren't paying direct attention. And by the time that noticing happens, the shift is already established, already embedded in behavior, in norms, in the emerging expectations of a new generation who grew up after the change and have no memory of what the previous baseline felt like. And that is what makes this particular trend more significant than most social commentators are currently willing to acknowledge. But there's one final distinction that needs to be drawn, because without it, this entire analysis risks collapsing into a single narrative that misses something important. There is a fundamental difference between choice and default. Right now, in 2025, for the men at the leading edge of this shift, staying single is a choice, a deliberate, considered, actively made decision. These are men who looked at the available options, weighed the costs and returns, and consciously selected independence as their preferred operating mode. That choice has a particular quality to it. It is owned. It is intentional. It carries the psychological weight of something genuinely decided. But if the trend continues in the direction it is heading, if the normalization process completes and independence becomes the default assumption for how men approach their lives, then the nature of that choice changes fundamentally. It stops being a decision that a man makes. It becomes the water he swims in without noticing it. And that changes everything. Because what is chosen consciously and what is absorbed unconsciously produce very different psychological outcomes. The man who chooses independence deliberately builds a life around that choice, with intention and direction. The man who defaults into independence without ever fully choosing it may find himself at 40, wondering how he arrived where he is. What feels like freedom when actively chosen can feel like isolation when passively absorbed. And this distinction matters enormously for where this trend leads in human terms, not just in demographic statistics or economic projections, in the actual lived experience of the people inside the shift. So picture 2030, not dramatically, not in the colors of crisis, in the quiet colors of a changed normal. More men living independently, not transitionally, as a stage on the way to something else, but permanently, as the designed architecture of their lives. Fewer long-term relationships forming in the traditional pattern. More selective, more deliberate, more clearly negotiated partnerships among those who do form them. Longer periods of singlehood across the adult lifespan. Different expectations of what relationships are for, what they require, what justifies the investment of entering one. A completely restructured set of social norms around what a successful adult male life is supposed to look like. And underneath all of that, still operating, still fundamental, still shaping everything. Human beings who want connection, who want to be known and valued and part of something larger than themselves. That does not disappear. That is not what this trend eliminates. What it eliminates is the automatic assumption that traditional relationship structures are the vehicle for meeting those needs. What it produces is a generation of men who are, for better and worse, designing new answers to ancient questions. And the real question is not whether this is good or bad, not whether this represents decline or evolution, not whether it should be celebrated or reversed. The real question is whether the people and systems that will live inside this changing landscape are paying close enough attention to understand it before they find themselves already living in its consequences. Because the biggest changes are never the loud ones. They are the quiet ones, the ones that happen in the accumulated weight of individual decisions that each seem too small to matter, until the day you look up and realize that the world looks different, and has for some time, and nobody noticed, until now.